It's not enough. Not near enough. What? It's not enough to be beautiful or handsome or multi-gifted or intelligent or courageous. Hundreds of biographies tell that story. It's not enough to have all these natural gifts. Something else is absolutely necessary for happiness, for success, for real achievement. May I give you a few examples? I think of Oscar Wilde, that brilliant Irishman, playwright, who had a genius for words. At heart he was kind and generous, but his wrong behaviour killed his mother and his wife with grief and brought shame, lifelong shame, upon his two sons. This brilliant man probably suffered more than any other man in the British Empire. He went through 6 years of hell, and to him they seemed like 6,000 years of hell. Here's the story. Oscar Wilde was born in 1854 in Dublin. His father, a successful surgeon. His mother, a poet, patriot. As he neared 20, he went to Oxford. Tragically, through a prostitute, he contracted syphilis. Mercury was the treatment in those days, but they sent his teeth black. A contemporary described what he looked like in later years: pasty-faced, red cheeks, bad protruding teeth, childlike lips. He ate little, but he constantly smoked opium-tipped Egyptian cigarettes, and he constantly drank absinthe, which he said gave him visions and dreams. He was the most well-known playwright in Britain in the mid-1890s. People loved his plays. The Importance of Being Ernest, Lady Minderwere's Fan, etc. He also wrote a book, caused a great controversy, The Picture of Dorian Gray. Handsome young man who made a Faustian bargain with the devil. That a painting of him would receive all the results of his careless life and the passing of years. But in that book, he seemed to teach many immoral things, so it caused much controversy, though it gave a lot of joy to young men in London. Oscar seemed to company most with young boys, and he made an enemy of the Marquis of Queensberry, whose son, Lord Alfred Douglas, a vicious, selfish, mean person who looked outwardly wonderfully handsome, but his son was in love with Oscar Wilde. The result was a series of trials, because Wilde taught took Queensberry to court for libel, but the tables turned and Oscar was sentenced to 2 years of hard labour. This was the opposite of all his previous years. He wrote about prison was characterised by insomnia. He had to sleep for weeks on a bare board, no mattress. He said, secondly, it's characterised by hunger. The food was terrible. He found he couldn't eat most of it. What he did eat made him feel sick. And the third thing he said about prison in those days, before the prison reforms, which came after his time of servitude, the third thing was disease. Many of the prisoners got diarrhoea. It was a terrible 2 years. He was not allowed in the early months to have books or pen and paper until a better superintendent came who was kind to him. Finally, he is released. He's standing on Clapham Station to go to the original prison from which he was to get a discharge. But people recognise him, and soon there's jeering and laughing, and one man spits at him. For the rest of his life, at that part of the day, he wept. He went to France. He knew no one would talk to him in England, or very few. He did not get on well in Dieppe, and he found he was unable to change his ways. He still pursued sex, male and female, but now he was penniless except for what friends sent him, and yet he was a generous man at heart. And when friends sent him a lot of money, and he was in a tiny town in France, he called together the children at the time of the Diamond Jubilee for Queen Victoria, and he held a party for them. He was naturally generous, but not wise. He said later, I deserved what I got. We should live as under the eye of God. They were terrible 3.5 years in France. He was sickly, degenerating. Even hotel keepers didn't want him till he found one that was friendly. Ultimately, he died. And the moment he died, there was an explosion. And from all the orifices of his body came debris. The doctor said it was a result of meningitis triggered by syphilis. Not everybody agrees with that, but Richard Ellman, who wrote the definitive biography of Oscar Wilde, says he definitely had syphilis, which triggered many, many of his troubles. There's another book on Oscar Wilde called Oscar Wilde and the Yellow 90s, called that because in the 1890s, many French novels with yellow covers flooded into England. This book has a fascinating chapter called The Lost Generation, about young men in London who followed Wilde, because he not only had a wonderful time himself, but he enjoyed leading others in the same paths that he followed. 2 things he wrote that'll never be forgotten. He wrote a long, long letter before he left prison. Took days to write it. Now it's called De Profundis, which is a Latin tag for out of the depths, comes from Psalm 130, in which he reviewed his experience and poured blame on the man he called Bosie, Lord Alfred Douglas, and rightly so. And yet he never got over his attraction to Douglas, even when he went to France. His funeral was a small, shabby affair with some things going wrong. Bosie nearly fell into the grave at one stage. It was a barren desert graveyard, not a single tree. So here was a man, multi-gifted and by nature kind and generous, lacked something, or did he lack someone? And his life was nothing but tragedy. Let me talk to you about Ernest Hemingway. Born in 1899, died in 1961 by his own hand, suicide. Marvellous writer, economy of style, very impressive, copied by others. He was a man who loved bullfights, and books, and women. He was married 4 times. His books will never be forgotten. For Whom the Bell Tolls, about the Spanish Civil War. Farewell to Arms, about World War I, where he was an ambulance driver. The Old Man and the Sea, wonderful story, very gifted. But Hemingway had a proneness for accidents. I have never read a biography of anyone who had as many accidents as Hemingway. Even in the toilet, when he pulled the chain, the whole box came down and hit him on the head. His last accidents were 2 plane crashes, and after that he was never the same, always depressed. When he was on his way home from hospital at an airport, he strolled out into the tarmac, heading for a revolving propeller. He wanted to die. Friends saved him from suicide. But not long after, in the early morning, he unlocked a cupboard and took out a rifle, held it to his head, and pressed the trigger. Hemingway, multi-gifted, hated his mother, gave up Christianity, but many people found much joy in his very great books. But he lacked something. Or did he lack someone? Now let me talk to you about Zelda. You may not have heard of her, but she married a very famous man, F. Scott Fitzgerald, who wrote The Great Gatsby, Tender is the Night, The Beautiful and the Damned, a great writer and very handsome in appearance, but like Hemingway, alcoholic, and alcohol killed him when he was only 44. Or was it alcohol and Zelda? Zelda was the daughter of a judge, one who was on the Supreme Court of Alabama ultimately. In her youth, she drank, smoked, and companied with boys. At 20, she married F. Scott Fitzgerald, just back from the army, though he'd not participated in warfare. But she was outrageous in behaviour, knew no restraints, just went her own way, and this was to lead to terrible disasters. Let me just read you a few lines from some pages in this book. Zelda and Scott attended more parties, more festivities than anyone else you have ever heard of. But let me read you a few things. When they got to New York, just married, Zelda, completely sober, dived into the fountain at Union Square. And when they moved from the Biltmore to the Commodore Hotel, they celebrated by spinning around in the revolving doors for half an hour. As she wrote in Save Me the Waltz, because she was a writer as well as an artist and a dancer, no power on earth could make her do anything anymore except herself. Dorothy Parker never forgot meeting Zelda for the first time astride the hood of a taxi with Scott perched upon the roof. Within a few months, she wrote, after our embarkation on the metropolitan venture, we scarcely knew any more who we were, and we hadn't a notion what we were. So she led a very strange life. But in the 29th year, she had a breakdown, declared to be schizophrenic, spent the rest of her life in health clinics, and in 1948 a fire broke out in one of the clinics and Zelda was burned to death. She became a Christian before her death, and they had one child, and she wrote to that child and begged the child not to follow her ways. This is what she wrote. Right things are the best things to pursue and to do by the nature of their being. A thing is right to do because it contributes the most constructive possibility. It's right because a consensus of the best authorities have endorsed it. It's the right course because it's the most spiritual remunerative of any possibility. Knowing the right, there isn't any alternative, because right is that which is most spiritually advantageous. The purpose of life on earth is that the soul shall grow by doing what is right. So she was a new woman in her last days, but she was burned to death, and her life was a terrible tragedy. For most of her life, she lacked something necessary. Or was it that she lacked someone? You have heard of James Bond. I made his acquaintance when I was 30,000 feet up in the air. Coming home from Canada, was flashed on the screen. Let me tell you the story of Ian Fleming. Ian Fleming was born into an aristocratic home. His father died in World War I. His mother had all the money, so he could only get money from his mother. But he became a member of the Royal Navy Volunteer Service and acted as a spy for the British Secret Service during World War II. Very efficient. But there are two things that ruined him. Well, three. First one was he despised half the world. He didn't like women. They crowded around him. He had no sexual shame or sexual mores. He used women, but he used them ruthlessly. The second thing is he lacked self-discipline. He smoked 70 cigarettes a day, had a third of a bottle of gin every day, and was careless about what he ate. He forgot that what we eat and drink today is walking and talking in 3 days' time. When he went to Eton, that great school, he was the greatest athlete they'd ever had, but he was young then. By the time he was 40, he was feeling a premature exhaustion. Went to a doctor who wrote in his records, Ian's arteries are beginning to go at 40. He was advised to change his ways and habits, but he never did. He fell in love with Anne Rothermere, a socialite married to Esmond, not Desmond, Esmond Rothermere. And they had sexual relationships for the last 12 years of the Rothermere marriage till the husband found out. She had a premature child to Ian in 1948, and Esmond thought it was his, but the child died. She was pregnant again in 1952, and Ian realised he had to marry her. Here he was in his 43rd year, and he'd escaped marriage, but now he married. It wasn't a very successful marriage. He was rather negative. She found him to be dominating. Whole tracts of their experience together, he was unpleasant, with just occasional oases of wit and happiness. They had one child, Caspar, who would commit suicide at the age of 23. Ian Fleming, in 1952, got the idea to write James Bond. And in his lifetime, 40 million copies were sold. Bond, of course, was an amoral adventurer. The books were highly criticised by many people. Even Richard Burton said, "I find Ian Fleming empty, banal, vulgar." Malcolm Muggeridge wrote very strong criticism, but the public didn't mind. 100 million copies of James Bond sold. A friend said to Ian Fleming, "What's it like to be so rich and so famous?" He said it was all right for a while, being known and recognised in nightclubs, restaurants, but now, he said, by God, it's only ashes. It's just a stupid, silly business. But his health kept deteriorating. He was sued for plagiarism for his book Thunderbolt. And during the 2 years of the trial, he would be sucking nitroglycerine tablets. He suffered from kidney troubles, sciatica, pain in the neck and in the chest. Doctor after doctor warned him, but he said, "If I can't live as I like, I don't want to live." So his health went down and down. He would sit on a solitary bench for hours looking at the sea. One heart attack in 1961, second heart attack in 1964 that killed him. He was only 56, died at 56. He lacked something. Or did he lack someone? His wife died of cancer in later years. Now I come to the one I think is the most interesting. Richard Burton, #1 box office attraction for the movies over the whole world. But he was born the 12th child of an alcoholic Welsh miner and a barmaid. Imagine this man later in an interlude teaching at Oxford undergraduates about literature, because he was an academic, even though he's an actor. Very well read and very loyal to his friends and very generous. He had about 20 relatives and he made sure they were all financially helped. But his life turned round when the film Cleopatra was produced, the most expensive film that Hollywood ever produced. There he met Elizabeth Taylor, and he tried to avoid her as much as possible for months because he was happily married, Sybil, and he had 2 children, Kate and Jessica. But ultimately, he found himself so attracted to Elizabeth Taylor that he realised he was fully in love for the first time in his adult life. And he'd had many experiences with women, in the preceding years. Elizabeth Taylor had been married 4 times before she was 30. 2 things preeminent in her thinking were money and marriage. She'd had 27 surgeries. She always seemed to be going to hospital. She was addicted to prescription drugs, and some think she went to hospital to get them. But she had surgery after surgery. Now, this is the 1960s. They're married in 1963. They'd be divorced 10 years later, then remarry a year after that, then be divorced again a year after that. They became the highlight of the 1960s. That decade, so different to all preceding ones. Baby boomers maturing, taking the bit in their mouths and running wild. No moral restrictions. Divorces multiplied. Authority was scoffed at. In 1960, the world went down and down and down. And leading them, Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton. They were so prodigal in expenses. They bought a yacht. They bought a jet aeroplane. When they travelled, they had a retinue of about 20 people, secretaries, nannies, security people, as well as 4 children, and cats, and dogs. But the thing that soured the life of Richard was guilt. He never became reconciled to the evil he had done to his first wife and children. The second child, Jessica, became schizophrenic, autistic. Richard only heard 1 word from her. When the family left him, Jessica called out, "Rich, Rich, Rich." And ever afterwards, he felt the horror of the empty life he'd given to his children and wife. The remedy, alcohol. All the people I have been speaking about were alcoholic or almost so. Richard married Susan Hunt and then Sally Hay. He was in movies till his last year, not so Elizabeth. She was called mature in the late 60s and had very little employment in Hollywood after that. But Richard was employed to the end. He'd never been sick in his life, but after 50 he got terrible arthritis. He was a man of great courage. He did movies when he was in terrible pain. He was a man you and I would have liked. Many, many virtues. But he lacked something. Or did he lack someone? All of these examples were multi-gifted. All of them were miserable. All of them were guilt-ridden. All of them had failed to ask the big questions. Who am I? Why am I here? How should I live? Where is God? How do I get to know him? They were all preoccupied with secondary things. They didn't know the words, "Seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all the rest will be added unto you." They didn't come to know the friend of sinners, the God-man who loved the unlovely, who was more willing to forgive their sins than they were to commit them. All their sins, whoever they were only a drop compared with the ocean of the love of Christ. Only the fine dust of a balance compared with the mountain of his mercy. According to Luke chapter 6, Christ is kind to the evil and to the ungrateful. But none of these people knew him, although Zelda came to know him at the end of her life. Is it not clear that it's not enough to be multi-gifted. It's not enough to be handsome or beautiful. It's not enough to be intelligent. It's not enough to have courage. It's only enough to come to the place where we no longer trust ourselves. When we go to the cross of Calvary and see ourselves crucified with Christ and come forth new creatures, reflecting the great secret of the universe, unselfish love. God grant you and I might live by that secret.